In this section, we're going to be taking a few minutes to think about decisions we make when determining the type of error we're willing to make. So, as we've talked about previously, in any type of measurement and analysis, we're going to have a certain degree of false positives and false negatives. Now, when we're making decisions about particular types of situations, we sometimes would prefer to err on the side of having a false positive, or sometimes we prefer to err on the side of having a false negative. So to kind of think about that, we're going to look at two different examples that are very common in society. One is screening for disease, and the other is conviction for murder. So when we're screening for a disease, we have the possibilities of a false positive and a false negative. Let's look at the two different outcomes for these to then think about how we would decide which one we'd be more willing to incur. So if we have a false positive, the patient's going to have some unnecessary anxiety. They're going to think that they have a disease that they don't. However, with more stringent testing, which is usually more expensive or invasive, it will indicate the true state that the person does not have the disease. However, if we have a false negative, the patient's going to feel relieved because they are in fact ill. The disease will continue to progress through their body. They may even ignore further symptoms as the test has ruled out these options in their mind. Thus, if they have, say, like somebody goes, oh, well, this is a common symptom of this particular illness, they'll say, oh, I know, but I don't have that. I had the test and I'm clear. So they will not pay attention to symptoms that they would otherwise have given more attention to. So as the disease progresses further, the greater the damage and the lower the rate of recovery. So we can see when we're looking at here at screening for a disease, our decisions about what type of error we're more comfortable with need to be shaped by the possible outcomes of the two different types of errors. So with a false positive, the person has some initial unnecessary anxiety, but then the situation is resolved appropriately. If we're looking at the false negative, we can see that in fact we're going to be putting the person's health at risk as the disease is going to continue to progress and they may even ignore symptoms they would otherwise have given attention to. This is in fact the case when you have a lot of the very quick and early screening tests for particular types of cancer and other diseases. They're set up to be more likely to produce a false positive than a false negative, because if we're going to make a mistake, we would rather say the person has a disease they in fact do not have, as the long-term consequences there are less than if we say that they don't have the disease when in fact they are ill. Now let's look at a different situation when we're looking at conviction for murder. So this is looking at our judiciary system and how it's set up. So if we have a false positive, a person who is actually innocent will be executed or at the very least face many years in jail as they attempt to correct this error through retrials. The destruction to their life and the lives around them is tremendous, and society also is not any safer as the actual perpetrator is still free. Now, the consequences for a false negative is the person has actually committed the crime but is found not guilty and is released, and the society continues to be at risk from this perpetrator. So when we're looking at this situation, we can see that the outcomes for the two different types of mistakes are very different in magnitude than when we were looking at for testing for a disease. So in this instance, if we have a false positive, the magnitude of destruction is much higher. So if the person whose life is either removed through the death penalty or spends a life in jail, which then affects the lives of the many people around them, friends, family members, and other individuals, and our society is still at risk. The perpetrator is still free. And in fact, also that investigation most likely would have been closed because it would have said that we had caught the perpetrator. If we have a false negative, the society still continues to be at risk from the perpetrator. The person is still out there. And that is a serious problem. However, if we were looking at this particular issue, although the person that has committed the crime is found guilty and not released, that is negative, but we do not have the negative of destroying an innocent person's life and the lives of people around them. So, if you look at our judiciary system, it is set up where it is more likely to err on the side of the false negative. That's what you have in your language of innocent until proven guilty. That means the weight of proving guilt has to dominate beyond what we would call a reasonable doubt. So, when we're looking at our judiciary system, that's set up for a different type of preference for a particular type of error based on the negative outcomes. So, as we go along in this course, and we're looking at the different types of errors that we make, do keep in mind that although in this class we tend to be picking a general rule of thumb for what type of error we're willing to make in terms of doing statistical problems, that decision would vary depending upon the situation and the possible outcomes of having a false positive or a false negative if you're applying this in real life.